In order to understand the development of hip hop, it's important to examine the music and movement that influenced it the most. Motown was a model for a black owned music business, but Motown's focus was on creating hits that appealed to both black and white audiences. The success of Motown was supposed to show that African Americans could compete financially in a white man's world. The hope, perhaps, was that the respect Motown received from white audiences might also carry over into more equality for black Americans in all areas of society. But as the civil rights movement grappled with the death of Martin Luther King Jr., it became clear to some that a more radical approach to African American liberation might be necessary. This movement, that developed in the late 1960s, is known as Black Power. In this presentation, we'll try to understand the Black Power movement as it came to expression in the music called Southern Soul. Before we examine Southern Soul music, let's highlight some of the main principles or ideas behind the Black Power movement. The first is racial pride. This is expressed in the phrase, "Black is beautiful." The Black Power movement was tired of the burden placed on African Americans to try to fit into white-dominated culture. African Americans were encouraged to cultivate their own cultural heritage, to take pride in who they were and not apologize for it. They wanted to determine their own fate, build their own schools, communities, and businesses. African Americans in the inner cities often inherited neighborhoods where businesses were absent, gone with the previous residents. Many African Americans were too poor to start businesses, or they suffered from discrimination if they tried to get funding or access to resources. The result of a long history of poverty and discrimination meant many people in the African American communities lacked the skills and resources to build businesses in the community. This led to huge unemployment and increased criminal activity in these neighborhoods as people tried to find ways to survive. The Black Power movement encouraged the development of black-owned businesses in order to liberate African Americans from this cycle of destruction. Racial pride, self-determination, and independent businesses are all reflections of the separatism of the Black Power movement. Martin Luther King's attempt to work through the given political system resulted in his assassination, as some interpreted it, so some blacks thought it better to separate from that system altogether, to create their own nation rather than become corrupted and destroyed by a nation that seemed set against them. If you're going to be a separate nation, you'll need your own army, and that's what the Black Panther Party tried to offer. Of course, this seemed very threatening to city police forces, which led to several armed conflicts throughout the early 1970s in many cities. The idea of arming people to produce social change may seem like an unnecessarily provocative act, though brandishing weapons to defend one's rights as an American is a common national practice, as we've seen in recent years with the gun control debate. If you can imagine the sense of threat many urban blacks must have felt in the late 60s as they watched their leaders gunned down and faced the violence of white police forces in their neighborhoods as protests led to riots, the idea of arming your neighborhood for defense is quite understandable. Another aspect of the Black Power movement is Pan-Africanism. This is the idea of solidarity, unity of all Africans. Pan-Africanism is reflected in African Americans dressing in African clothing and adopting African words and music styles. It's an embrace of a cultural heritage consistent with the Black is Beautiful model of racial pride. Pan-Africanism is reflected in the Black Arts Movement, a group of artists that gathered in Harlem and tried to develop a uniquely African American voice in the arts. The impetus for uniting black artists came from Amiri Baraka, whose name you should recognize as the author of the Blues People reading from earlier in the semester. An excellent documentary about the development of the Black Power movement came out in 2011. The Black Power mixtape brings together footage taken by Swedish journalists who who were curious about what was going on in the inner cities of America. The footage was found 30 years later and mixed into a finished film. This documentary is an excellent way for us to hear some of the thoughts and feelings of people living the reality of inner city problems in the late 60s and early 70s. One of the narrators in the documentary clip that you hear was a founding member of the Last Poets, an influential musical group that some credit with the first hip-hop album. The combination of spoken word poetry about street realities and African rhythms certainly sounds a lot like what would become hip-hop. The name of the group is based on a South African poem that suggests the time for poetry was coming to an end and that guns would replace poems. The most popular music in the African American community in the late 60s and early 1970s was soul music. Soul combined the church singing of gospel with the secular blues style. The majority of soul hits were produced on Atlantic Records in New York, Motown in Detroit, and Stax Records in Memphis. Of the three record labels, Stax reflected the values of the Black Power movement the most, with a sound known as Southern Soul. The gritty style also led to what would become funk in the late 60s and 1970s. In order to hear the difference between Southern Soul and other soul songs, let's listen to one of the earliest forms of soul music, recorded by Ray Charles on Atlantic Records. You may recognize the song as a sample used by Kanye West on his 2005 hit single, Gold Digger. Now let's take a closer look at some of the recording artists who helped make Stax Records one of the most important record labels in American popular music. As the documentary Stax Soulsville, USA recounts the label's history in an old theater in Memphis, Tennessee, we will see how many aspects of the Black Power movement, especially Black pride, Pan-Africanism, and self-determination, are exhibited.